So we just saw the garden. Marco was able to take just rocks and rubble and transform it in Celia's mind so that she could actually see all the flowers. She could feel the warmth from the lanterns. She could feel the water rushing over her hand and all of that. Okay, so he is so good at this that she says you should be called the illusionist, not me. That would fit you better. Okay, so part 3 of the chapter, we're just going to continue on with our tour. I suppose the beautiful woman who can manipulate the world with her mind is too unwieldy. I don't think that would fit on the sign outside my tent. His laugh is low and warm, and Celia turns away to hide her smile, keeping her attention on the swirling water. There is no use for one of my specialties as well, she says. I am very good at manipulating fabric, but it seems so unnecessary given what Madame Podva can do. She twirls in her gown, the silver catching the light so she glows as brightly as the lanterns. I think she's a witch, Marco says, and I mean that in the most complimentary manner. I think she would take that as a compliment indeed, Celia says. You are seeing all this as well, exactly as I see it? More or less, Marco says. The nuances are richer the closer I am to the viewer. Celia circles to the opposite side of the pond, nearer to where he stands. She examines the carvings on the stones and the vines twining around them, but her gaze keeps returning to Marco. Any attempt at subtlety is ruined when he repeatedly catches her eyes with his own. Looking away again becomes more difficult each time. Okay, so they both keep catching each other's eye, and even though they're trying to fight it, it's happening more and more, and they kind of don't want to tear their eyes away from each other. It was clever of you to use the bonfire as a stimulus, she says, trying to keep her attention on a tiny glowing lantern. I'm not surprised you figured that out, Marco says. I had to come up with some way of staying connected since I am not able to travel with the circus. The lighting seemed a perfect opportunity to establish a lasting hold. I didn't want you to have too much to control after all. What's up, dude? Yeah. No. And don't come in again, okay? Let mommy finish. It had repercussions, Celia says. What do you mean? Let's just say there's more that is remarkable about the Murray twins than their hair. And you're not going to tell me what it is, are you? Marco asks. A lady cannot reveal all of her secrets, Celia says. She pulls a rose down from a hanging branch, closing her eyes as she inhales the scent. The petals velvet soft against her skin. The sensory details of the illusion are so luscious it is almost dizzying. Who thought to sink the garden, she asks. Shandrush. It's inspired by another room in the house. I can show you that one if you'd like. Celia nods, and they retrace their steps through the garden. She stays closer to him as they walk, close enough to touch, though he keeps his hands clasped behind his back. When they reach the terrace, Celia glances back at the garden where the roses and lanterns have reverted to dirt and stone. Okay, so if we're paying attention, we know that most people inside of the circus are not aging or changing very much, but we should be noticing that Poppet and Widget do get older. Okay, I think that is because they were not born early enough for Marco to have written their names in the notebook. Remember, right before the bonfire was lit, Marco threw the notebook into the bonfire and that bound everyone to the circus. Poppet and Widget were not born yet, so they weren't in there. And I think that is why they're actually aging when nobody else is. Okay, but Celia also just told Marco, yeah, when the bonfire got lit, something happened to the twins that made them quite extraordinary. She doesn't tell Marco about their magical skills because she might be able to use it to her advantage. So she doesn't actually tell it to him. All right, so this next room we're going to go into is my most favorite room in Shandrush's house. If I had a room like this in my house, I would love it. Okay, so let's listen to it. Inside, Marco leads Celia across the ballroom. He stops at the far wall and slides one of the dark wood panels open to reveal a curving stairway spiraling downward. Is it a dungeon? Celia asks as they descend. Not precisely, Marco says. When they reach the gilded door at the end of the stairs, he opens it for her. Mind your step. The room is small, but the ceiling is high, a golden chandelier draped with crystals suspended in the center. The round walls and ceilings are painted a deep, vibrant blue and ornamented with stars. A path wraps around the edge of the room like a ledge, though the majority of the floor is sunken and filled with large cushions covered in a rainbow of embellished silk. Chandrash claims it is modeled after a room belonging to a courtesan in Bombay, Marco says. I find it marvelous for reading myself. Celia laughs, and a curl of her hair falls across her cheek. Marco tentatively moves to brush it off her face, but before his fingers reach her, she pushes herself off the ledge, her silver gown a billowing cloud as she falls onto the pile of jewel-toned cushions. He watches her for a moment before copying her action, himself sinking into the center of the room alongside her. Okay, so this room is like I think they said it was like a hexagon shape or something like that. It's a different shape, and it has like a path running around the perimeter of the room, but the center of the room is like sunken down with all these beautiful pillows. Like it's so plush and comfy that Celia is able to jump off the side and land in there. And then Marco follows her and does the same thing. And Marco says he loves this particular room for reading, and that's why I wish that I had a room like this. I also think it would be cool if we had a reading room like this at school that we could just, like when it was SSR time, we could go to the reading room and we could all lay in the pillows and read. Wouldn't that be awesome? So now picture this. Okay, they're both laying kind of like side by side in this magical room. We're going to hear in just a second that the ceiling is charmed to look like the night sky. Okay, so they're going to lay in the pillows, look up at the stars, and talk for a little bit. So romantic. Okay. They lie staring up at the chandelier, the light reflecting over the crystals, turning it into the night sky without need of any illusion. How often are you able to visit the circus? Celia asks. Not as often as I'd like. Whenever it is near London, of course. I try to reach it elsewhere, in Europe if I cannot escape from Chandrash for sufficient periods of time. I sometimes feel like I have one foot on both sides. I am intimately familiar with so much of it, and yet it is always surprising. Which is your favorite tent? Truthfully, yours. Why? She asks, turning to look at him. It appeals to my personal taste, I suppose. You do in public things I've been taught in secret. Perhaps I appreciate it on a different level than most. I also very much enjoy the labyrinth. I had been unsure whether or not you would be willing to collaborate on it. I got quite the lecture about that particular collaboration, Celia says. My father called it a debauched juxtaposition. He must have worked for days to come up with a worthy insult. He sees something tawdry in the combining of skills. I have never understood why. I adore the labyrinth. I've had far too much fun adding rooms. I particularly love that hallway you made where it snows so you can see the footprints left by other people navigating their way around. I had not thought of it in such a lascivious manner before, Marco says. I look forward to visiting it again with that in mind, though I had been under the impression that your father was not in the position to be commenting on such matters. Okay, so we finally, right now, we're going to hear what actually... No, we're not. I lied. We're not finding that out yet. Okay. He's not dead, Celia says, turning back to the ceiling. It is rather difficult to explain. Marco decides against asking her to try, returning to the subject of the circus instead. Which tent is your favorite? He asks. The ice garden, Celia answers, without even pausing to consider. Why is that? Marco asks. Because of the way it feels, she says. It's like walking into a dream, as though it is someplace else entirely, and not simply another tent. Perhaps I'm just fond of snow. However did you come up with it? Marco reflects on the process as he has never been asked to explain the origin of his ideas before. I thought it might be interesting to have a conservatory, but of course it necessitated a lack of color, he says. I pondered a great many options before settling on fabricating everything from ice. I am pleased that you think it like a dream, as that is where the core of the idea came from. It's the reason I made the wishing tree, Celia says. I thought a tree covered in fire would make for a proper complement to ones made from ice. Marco replays in his mind his first encounter with the wishing tree, a mixture of annoyance and amazement and wistfulness that seems different in retrospect. He was uncertain he would even be able to light his own candle, his own wish, wondering if it was somehow against the rules. Do all those wishes come true, he asks. I'm not sure, Celia says. I've not been able to follow up with every person who has wished on it. Have you? Perhaps. Did your wish come true? I am not entirely certain yet. You shall have to let me know, Celia says. I hope it does. I suppose in a way I made the wishing tree for you. You didn't know who I was then, Marco says, turning to look at her. Her attention remains focused on the chandelier, but that alluring, secret-keeping smile has returned. I didn't know your identity, but I had an impression of who my opponent was, being surrounded by things you made. I had thought you might like it. I do like it, Marco says. The silence that falls between them is a comfortable one. He longs to reach over and touch her, but he resists, fearful of destroying the delicate camaraderie they are building. He steals glances instead, watching the way the light falls over her skin. Several times he catches her regarding him in a similar manner, and the moments when she holds his eyes with hers are sublime. How are you managing to keep everyone from aging? Celia asks after a while. Very carefully, Marco answers. And they are aging, albeit extremely slowly. How are you moving the circus? On a train. A train? Marco asks, incredulous. The entire circus moved by a single train? It's a large train, Celia says, and it's magic, she adds, making Marco laugh. I confess, Miss Bowen, you are not what I had expected. I assure you that feeling is mutual. Marco stands, stepping back up to the ledge by the door. Celia reaches out her hand to him, and he takes it to help her up. It is the first time he has touched her bare skin. The reaction in the air is immediate. A sudden charge ripples through the room, crisp and bright. The chandelier begins to shake. The feeling rushing over Marco's skin is intense and intimate, beginning where his palm meets hers, but spreading beyond that, farther and deeper. Celia pulls her hand away after she catches her balance, stepping back and leaning against the wall. The feeling begins to subside as soon as she lets him go. Okay, just a few minutes ago, Celia said she has trouble not affecting her surroundings. Like she kind of has to like rein it in so that she's not always affecting everything around her. But something amazing happens when Marco touches Celia, like when they're actual skin to skin. It's like it's this electric current that goes through the room, and he can feel it, she can feel it, the chandelier shakes from it. Okay, so like in cheesy movies, sometimes you see the couple, they kiss and there's fireworks over them. Well, this is kind of like their version of that. But the thing is that it actually kind of scares Celia, and so she pulls back as quickly as she can. I'm sorry, she says quietly, clearly out of breath. You caught me by surprise. My apologies, Marco says, his heartbeat pounding so loudly in his ears that he can barely hear her, though I cannot say I'm entirely sure what happened. I tend to be particularly sensitive to energy, Celia says. People who do the sort of things you and I do carry a very palpable type of energy, and I am not accustomed to yours just yet. I only hope that was as pleasurable a sensation for you as it was for me. Celia does not reply, and to keep himself from reaching for her hand again, he opens the door instead, leading her back up the twisting stairway. They walk through the moonlit balcony. They walk through the moonlit ballroom, their steps echoing together. How is Chandrash? Celia asks, attempting to find a subject to fill the silence. Anything to distract herself from her still shaking hands and remembering the fallen glass at dinner. He wavers, Marco says with a sigh. Ever since the circus opened, he has been increasingly unfocused. I do what I can to keep him steady, though I fear it has an adverse effect on his memory. I had not intended to, but after what happened with the late Miss Burgess, I thought it the wisest course of action. Okay, so Marco is actually doing something to Chandrash. He's kind of like, gosh, it's hard to explain. Okay, he's kind of like, you know how we talked about how Isabel was tempering the circus to minimize the chaos? That's kind of like what Marco's doing to Chandrash, but it's having an effect on his memory. Okay, that's why sometimes he can't remember things. And Marco says he's kind of doing it for Chandrash's own protection, because after Tara Burgess started asking questions and started remembering details, she stepped out in front of the train and died, right? And we don't know that she did that all on her own. So Marco is like worried that if Chandrash figures out what's going on, then he'll be taken out too. Okay, so she was in the peculiar position of being involved in all this, but not within the circus itself, Celia says. I'm sure it is not the easiest perspective to manage. At least you can observe, Chandrash. Indeed, Marco says. I do wish there was a better way to protect those outside the circus the way the bonfire protects those within it. The bonfire? Celia asks. It serves several purposes. Primarily, it is my connection to the circus, but it also functions as a safeguard of a sort. I neglected the fact that it does not cover those outside the fence. I neglected even considering safeguards, Celia says. I do not think I understood at first how many other people would become involved in our challenge. She stops walking, standing in the middle of the ballroom. Okay, so Marco admits that not only is the bonfire for him to have a connection with the circus, but he also put some protection charms there. The protection doesn't extend outside of the circus, so that's why Tara Burgess was able to be hurt. Okay, so and Celia, though, she's still really impressed that he decided to put that in place because it never even occurred to her to try to help protect all the other people that are involved. Okay. Marco stops as well, but says nothing, waiting for her to speak. It was not your fault, she says quietly, what happened to Tara. The circumstances may have played out the same way, regardless of anything you or I did. You cannot take away anyone's own free will. That was one of my very first lessons. Marco nods, and then he takes a step closer to her. He reaches out to take her hand, slowly brushing his fingers against hers. The feeling is as strong as it had been when he touched her before, but something is different. The air changes, but the chandeliers hanging above them remain steady and still. What are you doing? She asks. You mentioned something about energy, Marco says. I'm focusing yours with mine so you won't break the chandeliers. If I broke anything, I could probably fix it, Celia says, but she does not let go. Without the concern for the effect she might be having on the surroundings, she is able to relax into the sensation instead of resisting it. It is exquisite. It is the way she has felt in so many of his tents. The thrill of being surrounded by something wondrous and fantastical, only magnified and focused directly on her. The feel of his skin against hers reverberates across her entire body. Those fingers remain entwined in hers. She looks up at him, caught in the haunting greenish gray of his eyes again, as she does not turn away. They stand gazing at each other in silence for moments that seem to stretch for hours. The clock in the hall chimes and Celia jumps, startled. As soon as she releases Marco's hands, she wants to take it again, but the whole evening has been too overwhelming already. You hide it so well, she says. I can feel the same energy radiating like heat in each of your tents, but in person, it's completely concealed. Misdirection is one of my strengths, Marco says. It won't be easy now that you have my attention. I like having your attention, he says. Thank you for this, for staying. I forgive you for stealing my shawl. She smiles as he laughs. And then she vanishes, a simple trick of distracting his attention long enough to slip out through the hall, despite the lingering temptation to stay. Marco finds her shawl left behind in the game room, still draped over his jacket. Okay, so she realizes he was the one that took the shawl in the first place just to get her alone. She doesn't take the shawl with us, which tells us she doesn't really care about the shawl. She stayed afterwards just so she could be close to him. By the way, if you look at your book, I know that the lighting's weird in here, but if you look at the book, we're about to enter part 3 of the book. Okay, so we are making progress, and we're like, the deeper we go into the book, the more exciting and the more we find out answers to questions we've had the whole time. So stick with me. Let's keep plugging along, and we'll focus on the night circus, as long as we're stuck in this situation of being sheltered in place. All right, so longest chapter ever. I'll record some more chapters tomorrow. Bye.